Good morning. My name is Elaine Wilson, and today I am going to finish a three-part series on Russian artists. All of these people, Marc Chagall, Natalia Goncharova, and now Anatoly Zverev, lived during the same time periods, not at the same time. Zverev is the youngest. He was not born until 1931, and he also dies at the earliest age, at 55. I think you're going to find him to be fascinating. You may be initially put off a little bit by the way he looks. I know I was. But don't allow that to clutter your mind as I offer information about who he is and what he has contributed and why the whole world now looks at him as really quite an artistic genius and one that he never tried to be. His life is lived during the years of the Soviet Union, and he will suffer some with that. In the handout that I had available for you and still have available for you about him, I mentioned that he doesn't stay with his wife. I'll talk to you about why that happens. He will also be hunted down by the KGB on a regular basis, and I'll explain to you why that happened. So his life was not all so easy, but his work is magical. I have been to many of his shows, and I have several of his books, of his art. And it is, I think, the hardest part for me today with you is trying to give you enough time to absorb the quality of individual pieces. So up front, I apologize if I have to scoot along, because I do try to fill the hour, but not go beyond it very much. So let's get started with this new artist in your life, Anatoly Zverev. Anatoly Zverev looked like this, rather slovenly. Here's another picture of him that he did of himself. And I'm going to answer questions today for you as I go through, so this will be a theme. Who he was? Well, let's take a look at who he was. He's considered to be the first Russian expressionist artist. Well, you've gone through the work of Chagall and you've seen the work done by Goncharova, and each one of these people, all three of these people, work very independently of each other and actually of any other artist in the world, and that's one of the magics about them. So here he is. He was born in 1931 and he died in 1986 at the age of 55, and he never left Moscow. Now remember, Goncharova and Chagall both become citizens of France. He stays in Moscow his entire life. His father and he were very close until the time that his father died. Toly was Tolya, which is also a nickname for Anatoly. Tolya was about 5 years old when his father died. His grandfather had been an icon artist, so the family kind of thought that maybe that's where he got his talent, but he would ask his father to draw pictures for him, and his father used to do that. He said he hadn't kept any of them, but he wished over the years that he had, because they were memories of wonderful times with his father. His mother, after the father died, suffered a great deal with trying to support the family. There were actually 7 children born into the family, and only 3 of them lived. He had a sister who was 4 years older than he, and a sister who was 4 years younger than he. And she did all kinds of cleaning and laundry work. She was really considered to be a charwoman, but did everything she could to try to support them and help them survive. They were so poor that Tolya said that during those years what he remembered most was being cold, being hungry, and rats. They lived in a house where in order to keep the furnace going even for short periods of time, his mother would have to burn whatever was available, and oftentimes as a little boy he did sketches. Even as a young man, when he was still living there with her, he would do sketches on pieces of cardboard, and she thought that made good kindling for in the stove. And so we have no idea how many of his wonderful works might have gone up in smoke just to keep the family warm. When he started to school, he had 2 shoes, but his shoes were both different. One was a boot and one was a shoe. She couldn't afford to do any better. I have told you about the history of Russia and how difficult it got for people to have the creature comforts that we all take for granted now. Factories were producing, at the time that he was living, factories were producing what would be the equivalent of 1 new pair of shoes per person per year. And certainly those shoes were not inexpensive. So she found what she could, and if they fit well enough that he could walk without stumbling, he wore them. He was not a very good academic student. His grades went from A's to F's, just depended upon his mood and the subject. And he also was not a very healthy child. I can only imagine living where he did and in the circumstances that he lived through, that his health would have suffered. He was expelled from art school because he argued with the teachers. The teachers he said, a teacher's supposed to keep order. A teacher is not supposed to try to tell you how to paint. Now, this was not in a Russian language class or a Soviet history class. This was in an art class, and so they expelled him because he was just too difficult. He wouldn't do what he was told. And then he joined the Navy, and his health was so bad that the Navy said, this is just not going to work. We can't take you to sea with us, and so they forced him out. He will live most of his life alone, but among his friends. And he will live most of his life not calling any place home. When he is older, he will spend very little time visiting with his mother. He will go for short periods, but he could not call any place home, and you'll understand why in a very short time here. He was married to a woman named Ludmila, and they had 2 daughters, and they lived in a small flat in Moscow. But after the second daughter was born, he was concerned that because of the artwork that he was doing, that the family could be in jeopardy, and Ludmila's well-being and the well-being of his daughters was at stake. And so he did not live with them. He used to say to her, though, he would say to her, Ludmila, who loved you? I loved you. I have always loved you. But now, later on, in 1968, he will meet a woman named Oksana. Oksana is, you'll see a picture of her later, is much older than he is, but she becomes a port in the storm. And he will draw very close to her for emotional support and for friendship until the day that he dies. In fact, if he had a home, we would say that it would have been with her. The home where his mother and he and his 2 sisters lived was in an area called Sokolniki Park. It's the oldest park in Moscow, and because you have a history or a background in Russian history, it was where Peter the Great's father, Alexei, had his favorite hunting grounds. And if you look down here, there's a falcon that has caught a rabbit. And there's another man up here with a falcon. This is not a painting done by Zverev. This is a painting that I found that represents that old park. And this will be the place, this will be the area where Zverev will work and play in his youth. And speaking of working and playing, when his father Alexei was there, this was the home established in that park, which was at that time pretty much just hunting grounds. This would be where Peter the Great's father would have gone for his hot coffee or tea or glass of vodka. This is the park today. The park has wonderful public areas and it has quiet paths. It will be Peter the Great who will take this huge area. Look at the size of it. You can go in, these are the main doors, they're the main gates into it, but there are other openings. And look how far back the city of Moscow goes. And look at the size of this park in the city of Moscow. Peter the Great will define the area for people's comfort by creating pathways, which are still there. And there's a skating rink there in the wintertime. There are festivals around the entrances to the park. There are places where you can pick up a sandwich or something to eat. Russians especially like ice cream, and that's certainly available there, but it's a lovely area. And this is where he will find his first job. As a young boy, he realizes he has to help support his mother because there's no reliable income coming into the family. And this man will play an important role in the early part of his life until he dies in 1964. This man is an actor, and his name is Rumnev. You want to remember that name because he will introduce many other important people into the life of Anatoly Zverev, and they will help also to sustain him during his lifetime. There is a painting that Zverev did of Rumnev. The first job that Anatoly got after he got his certification in painting from the school was to paint fences in Solkoniki Park. And as you saw, the park is huge, and there were lots of fences to paint, and the fences also would be surrounding children's playgrounds. And so one of the things that he decided he would do was see if he could have permission to paint children's folk tales on the fence sides. And so the man said, sure, go ahead, that'll be all right. So he would show up with buckets of blue paint or red paint or whatever, and he would have a wonderful time painting folk tales on what would have otherwise been just a white fence. Well, Rumnev has a sister. And she is walking through the park one day and she sees Zverev painting. And so she went home and she said to him, you know, I think you need to take a look at this guy. He seems to have an awful lot of talent. Well, Rumnev did that. And he was quite impressed with him. And he invited him back to his apartment. You've seen the picture of how he looked. Tolya was not necessarily a dapper-looking man, but he took him back to his apartment and he had him do some paintings for him there because Tolya painted very quickly, and he will stay his supportive friend and, as I said a minute ago, introduce him to many other important artists. So I will be mentioning Rumnev's name again. When Anatoly Zverev signed his work, you'll find his name is always signed with an A and a Z and the year. And there is no rule. The name could be here, can be here, it can be in here. The letters, the A and the Z, become many times just an integrated part of the entire painting. Here he is, look at him. I don't know if I'd want to invite him home or not. Now, knowing now what kind of an artistic genius was, I guess I would say yes. But there was a man named Vladimir who wrote a poem about him, and I'm sharing this with you because you can look at him and I can read the poem to you, and it definitely describes how he looked at that time. A slouchy man rambling down the streets of Moscow, kicking with his scuffed boots, whatever he finds under his feet. And he keeps shuffling his feet without noticing or looking at anyone. He's going where he will ask people to let him in, or where no one is waiting for him. He is homeless, like a vagrant. Poorly dressed, he seems to be wearing someone else's clothing. If he has a shirt, sweater, or sweatshirt on, it's turned inside out. He liked it that way. His hair was disheveled and his beard grows in tufts. Everything about him is unusual. The way he walks, the way he holds his head drawn back like a bird, and the way he looks at his surroundings in detachment. When he is given clothing, and who wouldn't find a sweater to give him? This one is all stained with something. Give him something. If what he has is still suiting him, he'll accept the sweater, he'll be polite, but the next thing you know, it's on somebody else that he's found along the street in Moscow to gift with it. What was popular during the art of Zverev's day was social realism. Now, that is not the kind of work that Zverev will do. This is what social realism looks like. And in order to work as an artist, you had to work, if you wanted a good job, you had to work in this style, social realism. These pieces were all done by different artists. They show Lenin, they show Stalin, they are all about the glory of the USSR. Here's another example of it. And this began in 1932, so this was the year after Zverev was born, and it would last for 50 years. And the biggest problem for him was, if you were not painting as a social realist, then you had no access to paint, to brushes, to any of the supplies that you would need as an artist. You were not given access to those. And because of that, you'll find that he'll end up painting with ketchup and mustard and whatever else he could find. Now, I'm going to talk briefly about this piece and about this piece to give you a better perspective on what social realism is and why it was so far afield from where Anatoly Zverev says. The social realists could only paint happy workers. They could only paint people who were well dressed. If you notice in the tractor picture, the little girl, the tractor is steaming. Why? Because there's enough fuel, they don't have to worry about it. The tractor can be running while the man and his son are being fed food by this darling child wearing pure white, pouring milk into a bowl. He has a bowl here in front of him that he's holding that is filled with food. This is the supper for somebody out in a field. And I have talked to you intentionally about how things were over there. And people who were living in these communes did not have this style of life as a general rule. They just did not. And then look at this, look at the rest of this. Over here, you have a couple. They're being married, and you were not married in a church. It was an atheistic country. The churches were either closed, they were torn down. Remember, I told you intentionally, Stalin decided he wanted Moscow to look like a modern city. Here he is, building these skyscrapers, building apartments so people would have some place to live. The ones that weren't working in the fields could be brought in and have housing. But this kind of painting was showing a wonderful wedding in Moscow along one of the streets. But look at all of the construction going on and consider how many churches and private homes and shops were ripped down mercilessly so that this kind of end result could occur for Stalin. I'll show you one more. workers didn't always have tools. Soldiers didn't always have good uniforms. People weren't always healthy. But the artists who trained were honored during this period of time like astronauts or party officials. Now take a look up here first. These are some of the soldiers. You know very well, and I didn't go into it a lot because of the time frame that I had. The soldiers were not all well dressed. They didn't all have the shapkas that you see here. They didn't all have lots of food or the latest in artillery. And over here, take a look at this. I intentionally talked to you the second time I discussed Russian history, and I said specifically, Trotsky was 5'9". Lenin and Stalin were both 5'5". Look at the height that the social realist has given Stalin. This man is way taller than 5'5" in this painting. He has to look like that because it's social realism. And this man, if he would be 5'5", this guy has to be just clearing 5 feet. But here they are walking through the Kremlin. No church spires in the background, no onion bulbs for the Russian Orthodox faith, but lots of symbols that represent the Soviet Union during the time of Stalin. Oh, this piece created such trouble for Zverev. There's his painting, and there is one done by a social realist. Life magazine had sent somebody over to Moscow to do an article on the art of, then the state of the art in the country. And when the person came back, they had a copy of this, and they had this, and they are showing these in the same article. And Nikita Khrushchev went completely berserk. He put out, he put out an all call to find Zverev. He wanted him, and he wanted him incarcerated. He wanted him punished. He should not be doing things like this. What would the world think? This is social realism. This is what the world should see. Khrushchev's, there were some semi-legal exhibitions being shown in the country by other people. Those were all shuttered, and Zverev had to go into hiding. See, there's no wonder why he couldn't live with his wife and his children. And he will be tortured and he will be tormented by authorities until he dies. And he used to say, I'm not a communist, I'm a harmonist. I want to be in harmony with people, but I am not a communist. When he would be found and when he would be caught, he would often be put in prison, and they would intentionally break his fingers because they wanted to keep him from working. And sometimes his friends felt that he probably had been murdered, but then he would reappear. Somehow or other, he would get out. Now, how was he different? Well, I've already given you some examples, but before I go on, notice the quality of the work here in this piece, because this is a painting that he did of himself. His work is so immediate, it's so spontaneous, it's so refreshing. An artist that he will know of is Vasily Kandinsky. Kandinsky was also a Russian. He was born and raised in Moscow, the same as Anatoly. And he will go to Moscow University. He will actually teach at Moscow University for 6 years. When I talked about Goncharova, I mentioned that she belonged for a time to the German school called the Blue Riders. Kandinsky also is a part of that same group, so they would have known each other. Now, the artists during this period of time in Russia, depending on wherever they were, had feelings that they were spiritually lost. Well, there was no faith anymore. It was an atheistic country, and it was a very difficult time for them. They often felt that they were not connected to the world. And They often would use very strong colors like you see here or over here in their work, or they would distort forms, but they were trying to let out some of the anxiety that was within them. If you notice over here, Kandinsky has done a horse and a rider. And as you look at this, your eyes automatically go this way across the canvas. Why? Because the horse is running in that direction. And curiously enough, in this piece, you start here and come this way towards the leaves that this little bird is looking at. Two other artists that I have already talked to you about in the past. One is Edvard Munch, and another is, of course, one of your favorites, I'm sure, Vincent van Gogh. And if you look at their two works, they are considered to be expressionist, and then you look at the Russian expressionistic work of this cockerel done by, by Zverev. One of the things that calls to you in all of these pieces, I would think, would be emotion. These are pieces that are filled with emotion. They are filled with expression, hence the word expressionist. Look at this piece that Van Gogh did towards the end of his life called Crows in the Wheat Field, where the road goes off to nowhere. You'll notice that around this piece there's some burnt area, and I'll show you some more of those in that piece again and tell you that story in just a few minutes. Some people like to call him the Russian Van Gogh, because like Van Gogh, for the most part, did Van Gogh really ever have a home? No. He had that little place that he had in Arles for a while, but he didn't really ever have a home. And he said that when he went home, he felt like a shaggy dog in his parents' living room. This man will paint quickly. Van Gogh would paint maybe 3 pictures in a day. Zverev will do 3 in an hour. He used very strong colors, and he always created. You see the intense look on his face? He is looking at a woman. This is the woman's face. It's sideways. Mouth, eyes, nose there. And you'll notice that there is a piece of newspaper underneath him. When he would go to people's homes, which was where he did his work, and he decided it was time to paint, they had to clear things out. Otherwise, he would just start. He would start on the kitchen table. I'll show you a painting of one of those examples. I mean, he would paint on cabinet doors, on stairwells, wherever. But when he started to work, he worked. And he got very intense about it. And you couldn't really tell, they used to say, you couldn't really tell what he was doing until his last gesture across the page was made. And he would work with whatever things were available. So his personality did not separate from his work any more than Van Gogh. And look at this, his longing for the Russian Orthodox faith, and look where his name, AZ, is in this piece. And like Van Gogh, if he didn't have somebody else to paint, if he didn't have a subject or an idea in his mind, and he does illustrate books, and he is very prolific with that, but if he didn't have a direction, he would just paint himself. Here's a very good example of him in his interpretation of himself. Look at the myriad of colors in this piece. Now let's take a look at how this man who had no home, and because he wouldn't belong, would not accept Soviet realism, had no access to paint or brushes or paper, how he got his support, who helped him get through those days of his life. Well, one of them was this man, George Kostakis. George Kostakis was born in Moscow, but he was Greek. And George Kostakis will become a very, very important collector of Zverev's art. Not just Zverev's. He has Matisse, he has Chagall, he has work done by other important artists too. Here's one of the portraits that Zverev did of Kostakis. And he chose to collect the underground art. And that, of course, is the art that was not done as the social realist standards would have been. And he was introduced to Anatoly by Rumnev, whose name you now know, found him painting on the fences in the park. And he will amass a huge collection of Zverev's work. His daughter, Elaine, within the last decade, gave to Russia 200 pieces from her own collection. She's living in Athens now. She gave them back to Russia for a museum where his work is displayed on a regular basis. And she said, the reason I'm doing this is my father would want people to see his work. I can't have the world come to my apartment in Athens, so I'll send the work where it can be seen. Here he is standing in front of those huge apartment buildings that the Soviets designed so that people would, coming in from out in the country after having been displaced, would have some place to go. Here is Kostakis in his apartment, and look at the paintings behind him. And here he is giving Anatoly a kiss on the cheek. He was a very, very, very dedicated and strong supporter of his work. There are 3 pieces that Kostakis had. And don't you just love the cat? I mean, and as I said earlier, the roof here and the trees. And I can't give you enough time to study these as much as I think you might want to or ought to. So we'll just move along, but keep in mind that going back and looking at his work more closely is a wonderful, enjoyable adventure. This drinking will cause a lot of his problems towards the end of his life. He drinks way too much, and he will die of many of the illnesses that are a result of his poor lifestyle as a child, and then also of acute alcoholism. Look at these. There's your chicken again. And notice all the burnt parts around them. There was a major fire at Kostakis' dacha, which was not far from Moscow. And Kostakis was not there at the time. He had gone back to Greece. And all of these paintings and sketches of Zverev were still in his dacha. And it is really, the Russians say, a miracle. Look how the fire burnt around this image, but not into it. Look at this one, and then look at this. The fire came close, but it didn't destroy the work. And so now, when it's displayed as you see it. It's displayed on other surfaces, so the burnt parts are still there. Igor Markovitch was a very, very, very important conductor and composer during the time that Zverev lived. And again, through Rumnev, he met him. And he is able, because he travels back and forth to Paris and to other places, he will be able to organize some shows for Tolya so his work can be seen in other countries. Now, it's not seen in Moscow because it's all underground work, and Tolya could be sent to the Gulag if they found him. But he will do international shows for him. And look at this piece. You see Tolya's work changes. It changes as he looks at the person. He decides on how best to interpret them. And he said this of Zverev: he contrived a history of modern art for himself, not conscious of it, but by chance. His place is in the pantheon of the most perfected artist of modernity. And I think by the time I'm finished today, you might start to think he was right. Now, this man was also, Nemushkin was also an artist, but he was a friend of Tolya's, and this is the painting Tolya did of him. And this is a painting that Vladimir did of his own. This is his own painting. And he had been interested and sensitive to the art as a child. The story goes that when he was 9, he was in the Tretyakov Gallery. And you've seen this piece before. This is Ivan the Terrible after he has hit his son with his walking cane and killed him. And this guy, 9 years old, it was such a tragic scene to him, he fainted in front of it. The two men will become very close. Vladimir will suffer from bouts of depression, and he will consider suicide on occasion, and Tolya will talk to him, and he will talk him out of that. He will help him change his outlook. And look, it worked. Look, he lived until 2016, 1925 to 2016. He took the advice of Tolya. Tolya had many, many, many deep thoughts that he would share with people, especially in times of need. There he is with his darling wife, Ludmila. And here he is with the other woman in his life, Oksana. And she was 38 years older. She was 78 years old when they met. When he painted, he liked to have her right there beside him, and he would say if she got up and went for tea, he would say, the music stopped, I can't paint. I will be showing you this painting he did of her and this painting that he did of himself very soon. But this is his muse. This is his support towards the end of his life. There's Oksana. She's a lovely, lovely woman. And her husband had been a poet. Her husband died in 1963, and so it was after that time that she met Tolya. There's another sketch that he did of her in the background. And he always used to say, I paint the person that's inside. I don't paint the outside of the person. I don't want to interpret the outside. I want to interpret who the person is inside. These two pieces are just lovely. And how is this work created, and what are some examples of it? Remember, I pointed this out to you before when I showed you him with Oksana? There's another example of it. Wonderful piece. This is done with watercolor. Where he got those, I don't know. His patrons would be the ones that would be able to supply him with some of his art materials. Sometimes people call his work momentalism, because he said everything changes by the moment. You paint by the moment. You don't get an idea and then you sketch it and then you work on it for 2 or 3 days. Then you put it away and you work on it again. That is definitely a reliable and useful technique for many artists, but not for Zverev. Look at this cat. It's a wonderful cat, swishing lines coming in and creating this image of a cat that until the whole thing was finished, nobody was sure what it was going to be. And what did he paint with? Well, I didn't tell you that the reason he left his job in Skolkoniki Park was because the superintendent came by and saw that he was not painting with the brush. It was taking too long. He had brought a mop, and he was using the mop, and he was painting on the fence with the mop. And the superintendent said, I'm sorry, but this is against the rules. You're not allowed to do that, so you're fired. So he had to leave. And this, of course, was around the same time that he met Rumnev, and from then on was pretty much sustained by his friends, not his family, but by his friends. Now, he paints with anything he can find. He paints with his fingers. He paints with shaving brushes. He paints with combs, toothbrushes. One time he was doing a painting of a woman and he ran out of paint. And so he took tooth powder, white tooth powder, and he just sprinkled that all over the canvas. And of course the paint was wet, so it stuck. And it's a wonderful magical piece. Another time, he had finished a landscape for somebody, and the man that he had done it for said, "Oh, this is great." And Talia said, "No, it's not done." And he went over into the kitchen and he came back with a handful of oatmeal. And he threw that on the canvas and then shook it off. And the man said, "I have to tell you, it really made a difference. It really does look better." So when you look at his work, you are never sure if you're really looking at legitimate paint or you're looking at ketchup or cranberry juice or something else that might be around when he decides to paint. Here are two more that he does. And he said, I don't need paint all the time. I can use jam. Here's the tooth powder, dirty water, beet juice. One time he was in somebody's apartment and he took a glass of beer and he just spread that all over the surface of the painting surface and then began his painting on top of that. Another time he just got a glass full of dirty water from the kitchen sink. I mean, you just don't know what you are looking at, even when you are looking at the real paintings, which I have done quite a bit of. But look at this wonderful piece of all of the onion domes. And then, if you look carefully, there are houses in here. There are shapes of houses in this piece. And all of this would have just been, again, spun out very, very quickly. And what this wonderful fish. Look at the colors in this piece. Look at all of the detail and look where his name is. It fits in, but it's not overpowering. It just becomes a part of the painting itself. He said that he painted quickly because he didn't want to lose the impression. That was this momentalism that he used. But sometimes his objects are a little hard to see. Let me show you some. Three birds. Three birds nestled into this painting surface. And this could be jam. This could be beet juice. It's hard to tell. Sometimes he put down a color and then he would scrape through it, like you can see he's done here. And here is his name over here on this side. These wonderful birds just nestled into the painting. And it's almost as though you discover them. That he doesn't say, look, here is a bird. You look into the painting and you see it for yourself. He was a wonderful graphic designer as well. His sketches are immediate and amazing. Look at these. He would do buildings, he would do animals, he did people, but look at these pieces and look how individualized they are. I love this peacock. As you know, Goncharova's peacock is my favorite piece done by her. But look at this with these little dots for the combs on the top of these feathers on its head. And look at this piece. It's negative space that defines the positive forms. They're just wonderful pieces. I want to show you two other ones of elephants because he would repeat the same subject. As you see here, he's done the lion. And then look, the few lines that it took for him to create such a magical piece. Look at these two. The camera couldn't catch a better picture of this. Look at the elephant, the one walking away from you, the one coming alongside. And notice, he shows the elephant and part of the trunk, but then just lets it go. He knew when to stop. He knew when to quit so that his lines were quick, deliberate, intentional, And he didn't erase, he just kept going. And look at these two pieces. There's another technique that he used, which is called a touch technique. And in expression, and so along with being an expressionist or a momentalist, we can say that he had a touch style. And what does that mean? Well, you can actually see his fingerprints. He would paint with his fingers. And in this case, he had done a line drawing of this donkey, and then he's added all these textural areas with his finger. And look at the cat. Look at how it just comes up, looks over the top, and there it is. Just magical, amazing, very, very immediate work. Here are some of his landscapes. Look at them, they're all different. There are trees. He said that when he did trees, he liked to think of himself as being in the tree and then painting the branches coming out from it. So you have several of those, and this is kind of a takeoff between a spiritual, inspirational piece and also large trees. And down here you have a rural scene and some people in it. And then over here, and you can see as he painted these pieces, now knowing a little bit about him, that his colors changed based upon what was available. He just used whatever was available. And in this case, he had a little bit of pink. And if you study this, you'll see that it just is scattered through the painting in many different places. And you can tell that he had filled all of this in with color and then gone back in while the paint was wet and done some line drawing in this with the end of a toothbrush or his finger or the end of a brush, whatever he had. And there's another tree. Sometimes the paintings were filled, sometimes his work was very stark. When I look at this piece, I almost see a face in here, but then that's just me. I've studied that piece too much, I guess. It's another one of my favorites of his. He loved to paint beautiful women, sketch beautiful women, interpret beautiful women. Look at these. This is a woman who was a member of the, she worked for the French embassy in Moscow. There is Oksana. You see her again. Look at this wonderful immediate piece, and then this one, and how very different each one of these are. And then this piece, he was visiting this family, and dinner was over, and he said, okay, and he looked at her and he said, okay, kiddo, I want to immortalize you. And that's what he always said. He'd say, hey, kiddo, I want to immortalize you. And so he said that to her, and the family knew it was time for him to start to paint because that's what he wanted to do. And he would just take his arm and just push whatever was on the table away from him and start to work. And unless they slipped paper underneath his hands, he would paint on the tablecloth. And in this case, they had had cranberries, and he squeezed the cranberries. And that's some of this color that you see in this piece right here. He didn't care what you had on. He only cared about who you were inside. That's what mattered the most to him. Okay, social realism again, and Zverev's expressionism, and look at the difference. There's no way to know the personality of the artist who did this piece, but we can be assured that he lived a long and happy life and was well fed and well taken care of. We can tell a lot about this man and his life by the kind of work that he did, because he comes through his paintings. He becomes a part of his paintings. Look at the AZ here, the A, and then the Z in here, and there it is, down there again. And it didn't matter the subject. What mattered is that he captured it immediately. He said life changes very quickly. 1 minute is not the same as the next. You must capture the moment. It won't be until the year after he dies that there will be an official showing of his work, a legitimate showing of his work in his country. And during that showing at the Gogh Gallery, there were 300 of his best paintings. This might have been one of them. I took this photograph, and if you remember when I showed you a picture of Lenin, one of the ones that amused me about him was that there was a picture of a close-up of sculpture with a bird on his head, and I like this founder of the Gogh Gallery, the little bit of snow. We had quite a snowfall the day that I was there to go in to see this work. This woman is important, very, very important to the life of Zverev. Her name is Polina. And Polina will know Rumnev and will want to meet Tolia because she's very interested in the art. She's still alive. She's in her 90s now. But she will want Tolia to do some paintings of her. So Rumnev said he would arrange it, and so one morning she got up, and about 7 o'clock in the morning somebody is ringing her doorbell, and she grabbed her robe and put it on and went to the door, and Tolia walked in, and he had a big roll of paper under his arm, and he said, "Okay, kiddo, I am going to immortalize you." And he sat down on the floor. You had to watch him, because if he didn't put newspaper down or something, he'd just paint right there. Anyway, she had equipment for him, so she got that out, and this is one of the paintings that he did that day. And she said to him, "Oh, let me get dressed. I'm in my robe." He said, "I don't care what you have on. I only care that I can see you." And in 2 to 3 hours, he did 5 portraits of her. And this is that portrait. She and another woman, this one right here, Natalia Apaleva, the two of them, Polina and Apaleva, will decide that there is an opportunity in this building to establish a Zverev museum dedicated to him, using all the floors. Polina had been in cinematography. Her concepts of how to organize space and design rooms it's just outstanding. And every time that I have gone to one of the openings in this, or one of the shows at this museum, she has just reinterpreted. There are 5 floors in that building. She has just reinterpreted everything. And they do the shows by themes, but these two will work together on this project. And they really establish him as a standout Russian artist. And this is the only museum in the Russian Federation to date that I know of that is dedicated to a single person. He said this one time, "I never lived, I existed. I only lived among those for whom I was painting and who were creating myths about me." And he said a lot when he said that. How would you classify him? He eternally wondered. He had to. He had to stay ahead of the authorities. He would show up at somebody's house and his arm would have been broken. He never complained, he never explained. He just let things heal, and he kept moving on. He spent some time at Polina's home. He was there for several months at one point. He was considered by many to be the Russian Van Gogh, and I think you can understand why. And some referred to him as the Black Tulip of the Moscow Underground. He created according to his own laws, and as you look at his work, his style is his style. His style is not one type. It is not futurism. It is not impressionism. It is not abstract. Everything is something. But he had his own laws and his own rules, and he wasn't constrained by the social or the political times in which he lived. He left the world well over 30,000 works of art. There's a huge collection. In fact, I think the show is still running now in Moscow, of a collection of his work that was accrued by a man who was Swedish, and his ancestors have gifted the museum with some time to show that work to the world. But the museum shows his work in themes. It's all women, or it's animals, or it's folk tales, it's different things. But 30,000 works of art. He could not stand to be still, and he obeyed the normal rules of life and art, and he didn't. As I said, sometimes he disappeared. If he thought he was being followed, he would disappear, and he would not say where he had been. Finally, one of his friends one time said, "Could you just give me a phone number, so in case something, you haven't seen you for a while, I could at least call the number and I would find out if you were still alive?" And so of course he does that. But aside from that, nobody could keep track of him. I say this, he was a destructive genius. He self-destructed. He self-destructed with his lifestyle, with his lack of care for his health, with his affinity for too much drinking. And he does die with Oksana there on December the 9th in 1986. He was harassed and he was persecuted by Soviet authorities from the time he surfaced, because he would not follow the rules of social realism. And you know enough about the rulers of those times and that time in Russian and Soviet history to understand exactly what I'm talking about. There he is. And there he is with some of his wonderful sketches behind him. And he said this, "Life and painting are sisters. One is longer, the other shorter, yet you can never show and tell as much in life as you can in painting." And everyone who knew him said they thought they knew him, but they knew that they did not know all of him. And he left as Van Gogh had left. He left a lot of writing, personal biography that he did, parts that he skipped over in his biography because they were still at the writing, too painful for him to go back and remember. There he is. There are two of his sketches of himself, a third one over here. There is a wonderful woman up in the corner with a tear in her eye and a darling little chicken. And there is his gravesite and his photograph there. Thousands turned out for his service. He was loved and followed by anybody who was on the inside track and knew about the quality of his work. And he used to say, "You are your own happiness. The rest is incidents that you may like or not. It's up to you." Now, are there any questions or any comments for me? Okay, no questions, no comments. Here's where we have been, folks. You have had 6 weeks of this time with Russia, with me. You have background now in Russian history. Not a lot, but you have a little bit that gives you some experience from the time of Ivan the Terrible to Putin. I have showed you 3 Russian artists, and those Russian artists are all very different in the way they made their statements, but they all walked the same streets of Moscow during some of the same periods of time. And they all lived through some of the tough stuff that I had to share with you when I discussed the history of the USSR. Next week, I'm going to start another series, and that series is going to be about Spanish artists. So it's time to move geographically to another country. And in this case, I'm going to work through time. The earliest artist will be the artist El Greco. And I will discuss with you his life and also his work. Now, his work is spiritually based because he worked primarily for the church. He also worked as a wonderful portrait artist, but many of those people also were connected to him through the church. So if you're interested in Spanish art at all, you want to get on board for this first of about 5 or 6 different Spanish artists that I'll be covering, going clear through to Salvador Dali, and spending time with Picasso and Goya and with Velázquez. If you are interested in a little advanced information about El Greco, and as I said last week, not necessarily what I say when I talk to you, but what is also important about the individual, please be in touch with askpresenter@willowvalley.org, and I'm sure that they'll just zip out a copy, a PDF file of that for you. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this time with me and my love for Russia and certainly my love for America, but also 3 of my very favorite Russian artists. There are others, there are a lot of other ones, and they weren't all social realists. There are some wonderful other artists. At some point I may get back to them, but in the meantime you've had a sprinkling of this, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I've enjoyed sharing it with you. Take care, be safe, but don't be afraid, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Bye-bye.